At Thanksgiving, my son's wife whispered, "She eats for free, throw her out." Still, I placed the turkey down like I hadn't heard a thing, carving knife steady in my hand. As the scent of rosemary thickened, so did my memory of every bill I'd paid in silence. While their plates filled and their mouths smiled, I thought of how they'd mistaken grace for weakness. The same gravy she ladled over stuffing? Paid for, measured, and now accounted for. That's when I decided her eviction notice would be my final dish, served warm, with legal precision. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Elaine stood by the long oak table, her hands deftly smoothing out the corners of the linen tablecloth. It was the same one she had used for 30 years, white with a subtle blue floral pattern, the edges frayed in a few places from years of careful folding and refolding. She ran a finger over the fabric, remembering how her husband, Frank, used to insist on pressing it perfectly before every meal. He'd always believed that a well-set table was the first sign of a good meal, a good day. The scent of roasting turkey filled the air, mingling with the sweet tang of cranberry sauce. Outside, the air was warm for late November, and the sun filtered through the Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees in the front yard, casting a soft, dappled light through the open windows. She placed the last of the dishes in their precise places, the matching silverware catching the light. Her home, her sanctuary. Today, it was a theater. And the players, like always, would play their parts. She didn't mind. They were her family. The faint sound of footsteps reached her ears, and she turned slightly, her back still to the kitchen. Rachel, her daughter-in-law. Elaine didn't need to look to know Rachel had entered the kitchen. She could feel the presence like a weight on the air, sharp, careful, as if walking on eggshells. It was a trait she had grown used to over the years, this careful walking around things unsaid, this pretending to be civil when the cracks had long since formed beneath the surface. Rachel was never subtle, not when she thought she was in control. Elaine kept her eyes on the table, adjusting a fork just so. Behind her, Rachel's voice, barely more than a whisper, slid across the kitchen. "She eats for free. Throw her out already." The words hit Elaine like a cold draft through an open window. The soft hiss of the turkey's skin crackling in the oven barely covered the hurt, the ache that started deep in her chest. The air around her seemed to tighten, but she didn't flinch. She kept stirring the gravy, her hand steady, betraying none of the shock that rattled inside her. Rachel's voice continued, sharper now, pushing the knives in deeper. "She's just sitting there, year after year, thinking she's part of the family. It's pathetic, really." Elaine's grip on the spoon tightened, and the bubbling gravy threatened to boil over. She fought the urge to glance over her shoulder, to meet Rachel's eyes, but instead, she focused on the soft pop and hiss of the turkey. A familiar sound, a comforting one. Jeremy's voice, muffled, barely louder than Rachel's, followed. "I don't know, Rach. It's Mom. I can't—" His voice trailed off, a sigh of resignation, an unwillingness to step into the fray. It was typical of Jeremy, her son, the man who would do anything to avoid confrontation, to keep peace, even if it meant standing by while someone else suffered. Elaine's breath slowed. She had been married to Frank for over 40 years, had raised Jeremy through every milestone, had cooked for Thanksgiving every year without fail. Her hands were worn and calloused from decades in the kitchen. The weight of tradition, of family, had settled into her bones. And yet, Rachel, who had entered their world like a breeze, a stranger in a wedding dress, thought she could rewrite it all. The words continued to spiral around her, cutting into the space she had once thought was safe. She dried her hands slowly, the towel rough against her fingertips. The turkey would have to wait. Elaine took a deep breath, then turned and walked out of the kitchen, her steps measured, deliberate. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she refused to let it show. She had heard everything, and she had made her decision. She reached the small desk by the back door, a place she had always kept her notes, her recipes, her lists, her thoughts. She opened a drawer, the wood creaking with age, and pulled out her notebook. Flipping it open to a section marked Contingency in Gratitude, Elaine traced the edge of the page with her thumb. The ink was familiar to her. It was her own. The same careful, flowing script she had used for years. She had known, deep down, that a moment like this would come. She had prepared for it. The pen clicked softly in her hand, its metallic click echoing in the otherwise still kitchen. Her fingers hovered over the page. She didn't need to write it out in full. Not yet. She knew exactly what came next. She was done being the invisible matriarch. Done being the one who served without recognition. She had given too much for too long, and it was time for that to change. Elaine turned back toward the stove, where the turkey sat, golden and warm, the smell now sharp in her nostrils. She paused, just for a moment, before walking out onto the back porch, her notebook tucked safely under her arm. The sky outside was turning pink with the evening light. She took a slow, steadying breath, the weight of her decision settling into her chest. Her son would never understand. He would never speak up for her. But that didn't matter anymore. It was her turn now. And by Christmas, so would the final bill. Elaine stood at the head of the table, carving knife in hand, the warm glow of the overhead chandelier casting shadows on the white china. The turkey was golden, its skin crisped to perfection, the aroma filling the room. She moved with practiced precision, her hands steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. The knife sliced easily through the tender meat, the rhythm of the motion steady and soothing, as though she were still in control of this familiar ritual. The silver serving platter gleamed in the soft light as she placed each piece of turkey with deliberate care. She had done this 1,000 times, maybe more. But today, with every slice, she felt the distance between her and the family she had once known so intimately. The weight of Rachel's words pressed on her like the heavy warmth of the oven, but she didn't let it show. The smile she offered as she looked around the table was polite, almost serene, a mask she had perfected. Rachel, as usual, was the first to break the silence that hung heavy in the room. She lifted her glass of wine, a practiced false smile on her face as she stood. The clink of glass on the table sounded louder than it should have, cutting through the stillness like an unwelcome intrusion. "Thank you all for being here," Rachel began, her voice a little too bright, a little too rehearsed. She didn't need to look at her husband to know she had Jeremy's attention. He was always eager to please her, to validate her. Elaine could hear his forced chuckle, the nervousness in his tone. It grated against her, but she didn't flinch. "I'm especially thankful for family," Rachel continued, her eyes sweeping the room, "for the love we share and the memories we create. And of course, the wonderful meal we're all about to enjoy. A big thank you to my mother-in-law, Elaine, for always hosting such a beautiful dinner." The words were polite, but they didn't ring true. There was no warmth in them, no true gratitude. Just the same hollow recognition Elaine had come to expect. Jeremy laughed a little too loudly, his chuckle forced and too high-pitched. It was a sound that made Elaine's stomach twist. She had heard that laugh too many times over the years, the laughter of someone who couldn't, or wouldn't, say the words that mattered. Rachel flashed a smile at him, the kind of smile that had once made Elaine think they were truly happy together. Now it only seemed false. Elaine's hand tightened around the carving knife, the only steady thing in this fractured world. She set it down with care, trying to ignore the bitterness in her throat. As Rachel continued to talk, her voice rising in pitch as though to fill the silence, Elaine placed the turkey slices onto each plate, the sound of the knife against china almost soothing in its familiarity. Avery, as usual, picked at her food. Elaine saw her granddaughter's small fork push the turkey around on her plate, the girl's eyes downcast, her lips tight. She wasn't hungry, not really, but Elaine knew why. It wasn't the food. It was the tension, the unspoken words, the coldness that had settled between everyone at the table. Avery had always been observant, and today it seemed she noticed everything. Elaine's own appetite had vanished, replaced with a strange emptiness that had nothing to do with the meal before her. She reached for her own glass of wine, taking a slow sip, letting the familiar taste calm her. The silence between the bites was louder than any words could be. As Rachel finally sat back down, her toast over, Elaine picked up her own glass. The faintest of smiles touched her lips, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm thankful for silence," she said, her voice quiet but clear, the words deliberate. "It always reveals the most." Rachel's laughter bubbled up, unaware of the barb Elaine had just thrown. "Oh, Elaine, you're always so wise," she said with a dismissive wave, her tone dripping with insincerity. Elaine didn't reply. She didn't need to. The silence between them spoke volumes. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and carefully avoided glances. Rachel kept the chatter light, talking about their latest purchases and future plans, always with the same self-congratulatory tone. Jeremy nodded, occasionally chiming in, but it was clear he was just going through the motions. And Avery. Avery barely spoke at all. When the last plate was cleared, when the table had emptied, Elaine stood quietly. She said nothing, just gathered the dishes with careful precision, her hands moving through the motions like they always had. But the quiet felt different now, heavier somehow, as though it were filled with words that no one dared speak. Rachel lingered for a moment, glancing at Elaine but not offering to help. Of course she wouldn't. She never did. Instead, she and Jeremy began gathering their coats, ready to leave as quickly as possible. The ritual of Thanksgiving had already been reduced to a simple, mechanical event for them. Elaine didn't mind. She was used to it by now. As they made their way to the door, Rachel turned back. "Thanks again for dinner," she said, a perfunctory wave accompanying the words. Elaine didn't answer. She didn't need to. The door closed behind them and the house was quiet. Elaine stood in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the scattered remnants of the evening, the leftover food, the dirty dishes, the silence. It all felt like a weight she had borne for too long. And as the last echoes of their footsteps faded, Elaine turned back to the sink. The dishes waited. But this time, it was different. This time, as she washed the last plate, she knew something had changed. By Christmas, there would be no more dinners like this. No more forced smiles. No more empty thanks. It was over. Elaine sat in the dimly lit den, the faded armchair creaking as she shifted her weight. Outside, the shadows stretched long across the yard, the last hints of sunlight filtering through the trees, turning the sky a dusky lavender. The old house felt quieter than it ever had, even with the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rattle of the old pipes. She had lived here for over 4 decades, built a life inside its weathered walls, and yet it had never felt more foreign to her than it did now. The house had always been hers. Frank's too, in the beginning, but mostly hers. They had bought it before Jeremy was born, spent years restoring it, making it their home. It was the same home she had raised him in, the same rooms where she had hosted countless family dinners, where she had watched her son grow up and leave to start his own family. And yet, lately, It felt as though Rachel had claimed it as her own, as if she had somehow woven herself into the fabric of the place. Rachel always called it our place, her and Jeremy's. It didn't matter that the deed was still in Elaine's name. It didn't matter that she paid for the utilities, the property taxes, or the HOA fees with money from her own accounts. Rachel made sure to refer to it as our place, in front of guests, in front of friends. The casual, confident ownership in her voice made Elaine's blood boil, though she hadn't said a word for years. That was the thing about Rachel. She was always so certain, so sure. She acted as though it was a done deal, a foregone conclusion that this house, these walls, everything inside them, were hers for the taking. And Elaine had let it slide. Let Rachel think she had the upper hand. Let her carry on with her plans and her pretensions. After all, it wasn't worth the fight. At least, not until now. The back door creaked open, pulling Elaine from her thoughts. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Clay. He had a way of entering and exiting her life with a quiet kind of assurance that made him nearly invisible. He wasn't tall, but he had the kind of presence that made people take notice, the kind of man whose words were always measured, whose decisions were always deliberate. Clay stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the oak trees. His hands were in his pockets. The familiar black coat he always wore hanging loosely around his frame. She could see the way he looked at the property, calculating, assessing. He knew what she was about to do, what needed to be done. "You're early," Elaine said, her voice soft but steady. Clay turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Not early, just punctual. He walked over to her and handed her a folder, thick with documents, all meticulously organized. "Updated records? It's all there." Elaine didn't hesitate. She took the folder, opened it, and ran her fingers over the documents inside. She recognized the titles, the property assessments, the account balances. She hadn't needed to ask for an update. She had known everything was in order. She had known Clay would make sure of that. The first page was a copy of the deed. 100% Elaine Mathers. The words stood out in bold, crisp letters, like a stamp of ownership that no one could erase. She lingered over it for a moment, the weight of it grounding her. No joint ownership, no survivorship clause. This house would never belong to Rachel, not without her consent. "Utilities still in your name?" Clay asked, leaning against the wooden post of the porch, his voice calm, measured. Elaine nodded. "Paid by me. Always have been." She looked out at the yard, her gaze lingering on the patch of grass where Jeremy used to play football with his friends, where she had spent countless afternoons tending to the flower beds, pulling weeds. The memories, like the house itself, were all hers. Rachel could pretend, but Elaine was the one who had given everything to keep this place running. "And the HOA?" Clay asked, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "Same story?" Elaine's lips tightened into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Same story. My checkbook. Always has been." Clay tapped a pen against his leg. "You're ready to flip the switch then?" Elaine's eyes flicked over to him, meeting his gaze. His question wasn't just about the house, but about everything. About Rachel's audacity. About the long years of silent patience. Elaine had let so much go, had endured Rachel's arrogance, her entitlement. But there were lines, and Rachel had crossed them. Rachel had made the mistake of thinking that the house, her family's legacy, was something she could claim without a fight. "It's time," Elaine said, the words coming out quieter than she had expected, but they were firm. Clay gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Then it's done." Elaine looked out over the yard again, her gaze softening. This house had been the cornerstone of her life. It had seen her at her best, her worst. It had been filled with laughter, with tears. It was the place where Frank had kissed her goodnight, where Jeremy had grown up, where Avery had played as a little girl. And now, it was the place she would reclaim for herself. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the folder, and she let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle inside her like a stone. She would let Rachel think the house was hers for now. Let her believe it. But soon enough, she would see the truth. By Christmas, everything would change. Elaine sat across from Laurel Dean, the smooth mahogany desk between them glinting in the early afternoon light. The old clock on the wall ticked loudly, its rhythmic ticking a quiet echo in the otherwise still office. The faint scent of leather and paper mixed with the dusting of sunlight that filtered through the high windows. Laurel, always neat, always precise, flipped through a stack of papers with a practiced hand. Elaine had been here before, but today felt different, heavier somehow. Today, things were finally moving. Laurel's office, with its high colonial ceilings and well-worn furniture, had always felt like a place of authority. This was where family matters were settled, where decisions were made that could ripple through generations. But for Elaine, the act of sitting here, across from Laurel, felt less like a meeting and more like a turning point. "Laurel?" Elaine said, her voice steady but with an edge of something more behind it. "Let's keep this quiet. No noise, just paperwork." Laurel met her gaze over the rim of her glasses, her expression calm but knowing. "Understood," she replied, flipping through the stack of documents until she reached the final page. Her pen hovered just above the dotted line, waiting for Elaine's signature. The first document was the notice of termination of tenancy. Elaine had been patient, had endured years of Rachel's entitled behavior, but now, the time for subtlety was over. Rachel and Jeremy had been living there under the assumption that the house was theirs for the taking. They had acted as though it was a given. No more. The second page was property reassignment. Clear, unambiguous. The house was Elaine's, and by Christmas it would be Avery's, just as Elaine had planned. It was more than just a house. It was a legacy. And no one was going to take it from her. The last page was the amended will. Elaine had already made the necessary adjustments, removing Rachel and Jeremy from any claim to her estate. It wasn't personal. It was business. This was her family's home, and no one was going to treat it like an afterthought. She had made sure that Avery would inherit it all, when the time was right. Laurel slid the pen across the table, nudging it closer. "All that's left is your signature." Elaine didn't hesitate. Her hand moved with precision, the signature flowing easily across the page. This wasn't just the end of one chapter. This was the start of something new. Rachel had made her move. Now it was Elaine's turn. As Elaine signed the final document, the door opened with a soft creak, and the assistant poked her head in. "Elaine, there's a delivery for you at the house," she said, her voice a little too chipper. "Patio furniture. Something about a Christmas upgrade." Elaine felt a sharp pang in her chest, a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Rachel was already redecorating. She couldn't even wait for Christmas to start making it all hers. Rachel's idea of Christmas upgrade was nothing more than a new set of chairs and cushions, a fresh layer of paint over the family's old memories. It was the same thing Rachel always did. She tried to make everything her own, as though she could buy and reshape everything around her. Even this house, which had been built on memories of Frank and Jeremy, had now been reduced to nothing but a project for Rachel's personal taste. Elaine set the pen down with finality, her gaze never leaving the documents in front of her. "Let her have it," Elaine muttered, mostly to herself. "The furniture, the upgrades, none of it matters now." Laurel raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She'd known Elaine long enough to understand when silence was the loudest response. At home, Rachel was busy at her own self-appointed task, ready to show off her latest purchase. She had ordered the most expensive set of patio furniture she could find, and she didn't even care who paid for it. She'd only made one request, that Elaine's approval was unnecessary. Of course, Jeremy didn't think twice about it. Elaine could imagine it all too well. Rachel circling the yard with that smug satisfaction, arranging everything with a superficial sense of ownership. The new furniture would be placed on the patio as if it had always belonged there, as if it were Rachel's to command. Elaine could almost hear Rachel's voice now. "This is exactly what the house needed, don't you think?" Elaine's lips twitched into a smile as she stood up and gathered her things. Her plan was set in motion. Rachel wouldn't get to claim anything anymore. No more redesigns or redecorating. By Christmas, it would all be in Elaine's hands again, and Rachel would have no idea what had hit her. As she walked to the door, Elaine's phone buzzed. A message from Avery. "Avery. Grandma, are you okay? I saw you journaling this morning. Are you sad?" Elaine's heart softened at the message. Her granddaughter, sweet and perceptive, had noticed. Had she sensed the weight of the change that was coming? Did she know, on some quiet level, that this house, this place that had always been a sanctuary, was about to belong to her? Elaine's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, her mind swirling with 1,000 things to say. But in the end, she kept it simple. "Elaine. I'm fine, sweetheart. I'm just making sure everything's in place for the future. I'm not sad. I'm proud. And I can't wait for you to see what comes next." Elaine set her phone down with a gentle sigh and walked out the door, her mind sharp with purpose. She was no longer the woman behind the scenes, the one who let things slide. Now, she was in control. The future was hers, and no one, not Rachel, not Jeremy, could take that away. By Christmas, the house would belong to Avery. And Rachel? She would finally understand the cost of her arrogance. Elaine sat at the kitchen table, her hands steady as she folded the letter with precision. The ink on the page, black and bold, felt like the final seal on a chapter she had been writing for years. It was almost surreal how quiet everything had become since the decision had been made. The house around her, once filled with the echoes of laughter and the sound of her son's footsteps, now felt almost suffocatingly still. She took a slow breath, feeling the weight of her actions settle deep into her chest. This wasn't just paperwork. It was the culmination of years of silence, years of quiet resentment, years of enduring Rachel's entitled existence under her roof. Elaine had given Rachel the benefit of the doubt for too long. Let her pretend this house was hers. Let her reshape everything to fit her idea of the perfect family. But no more. Elaine pushed the letter across the table to where the pile of documents lay waiting. The certified notice of termination of tenancy was succinct, precise. Rachel had been living there, had been treating it as her own, without offering a single dime toward its upkeep, not a penny toward its maintenance. Elaine had allowed it, let it slide, but now it was time for Rachel to face the consequences. The notice, the carefully itemized breakdown of unpaid contributions, and the final date to vacate all sat before her in stark black ink. She read it one more time, making sure everything was perfect. It was more than just a legal move. It was the final note in a symphony of quiet frustration, a note that would leave Rachel no room to argue. The letter was ready. Elaine leaned back in her chair, her eyes glancing over at the window, where the last streaks of sunlight were fading into the horizon. The day was slipping away. But the work she had set in motion would not fade. It was just the beginning. The next morning, Rachel stood in the kitchen, sipping her coffee, when the mail arrived. She flipped through the stack with practiced indifference, sorting out the usual bills and flyers. But when she saw the certified letter, something in the back of her mind triggered. Her fingers tightened around the envelope as she tore it open, not bothering to look at the return address. Her eyes scanned the letter quickly, then froze. The words were like a slap to the face. Termination of tenancy. She blinked, reading it again, unable to comprehend it first. Her breath caught in her throat. The letter wasn't a polite reminder or a warning. It was the cold, hard truth. Elaine had done it. She had officially ended their stay in the house. The place Rachel had so effortlessly claimed as her own. She felt the blood drain from her face as she flipped through the breakdown of unpaid contributions. Utilities, HOA fees, maintenance. All of it. All unpaid. All on Elaine's dime. Rachel's pulse quickened, her mind racing. She can't do this, she thought, her chest tightening. She turned to Jeremy, who was just entering the kitchen, his eyes squinting from sleep. "Jeremy, you need to look at this." Jeremy frowned as he took the letter from her, his eyes scanning the contents. "She can't do this," he muttered, his voice low, disbelieving. "This isn't legal, is it? She can't just throw us out like this. We've been here for years." Rachel's eyes narrowed. She had built a life here, or at least, she had tried to. This house had been supposed to be her future, hers and Jeremy's. She had picked out the furniture, the decor, had made plans for a future here. But now, everything was crumbling. "Rachel," Jeremy said, his voice tinged with panic, "we need to talk to someone. We can't just let her do this." Rachel shook her head, her eyes flashing with anger. "No, I'll handle this. We'll fix this. I won't let her ruin everything." But deep down, even Rachel could feel the weight of it. Elaine had won. The ball was in motion. Meanwhile, across town, Elaine was already moving forward, her steps unhurried but firm. The house was quieter now without Rachel's presence, the weight of her departure already in the air. As she watched the sun rise higher in the sky, Elaine felt a strange peace settle over her. The next part of the plan was set. There were no more moves to make. There were only steps left to take. She reached for her phone, dialing Clay's number. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Elaine," Clay said, his voice warm but professional. "Everything in order?" Elaine looked out the window at the house, feeling a strange mix of triumph and relief. "Tell the bank to unfreeze the transition funds. It's time." Clay's voice was steady. "Understood. It's all set on this end." Elaine nodded to herself, her grip tightening on the phone. "By Christmas, it'll be done." She hung up the phone, the decision final, the next steps locked in place. There was no turning back now. Elaine stood in the kitchen, her eyes falling on the empty table, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of the house, her house, on her shoulders. The legacy she had built, the one Rachel had tried to claim, was about to be passed to the one person who had always mattered, Avery. And when Rachel came back to fight, it would be too late. The last pieces were falling into place. The house would be hers again, and Rachel would finally understand that she had underestimated the power of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Rachel stormed through the front door, her heels clicking sharply against the old hardwood floors. The familiar creak of the doorframe seemed to mock her, as if the house itself was bracing for the confrontation. She had only just received the termination notice, but it felt like a tidal wave crashing into her carefully curated life, a life that had always felt just within her grasp. She found Elaine in the living room, standing by the window with her back turned, gazing out at the quiet street. Her face, as always, was calm. But there was something in the stillness of the room that made Rachel's chest tighten. She couldn't stand it. Elaine had always been so composed, so unflappable. She hated that about her. Today, it felt like it was a reminder of just how little power Rachel had in this situation. Elaine turned slowly, almost as if she had known Rachel would walk in. She had expected this moment after all, though it still struck her with the weight of inevitability. "You're really going to do this?" Rachel's voice broke through the silence louder than she intended. It wasn't just anger, It was the sound of everything she had built crumbling in front of her. She stepped forward, her hands trembling at her sides, but her eyes sharp with fury. "You're going to throw us out like we're nothing? After all these years?" Elaine didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at her daughter-in-law, her gaze level, unwavering. The weight of Rachel's words hung in the air, but it was clear Elaine wasn't going to rise to the bait. "Rachel," Elaine said quietly, her voice carrying that same quiet authority that had always been there, even when Rachel had tried to dismiss it. "The address is mine. So is the silence." Rachel's face twisted, her lips curling in a sneer as if she could will away the truth Elaine had just spoken. It stung, that simple, undeniable statement, more than any of the things Rachel could have said. There was no denying it. This house had never truly belonged to her. It never would. "You think this is over?" Rachel spat, stepping closer, her voice rising with each word. "You think you've won? This house was supposed to be mine, Elaine. Jeremy and I were going to take over." "It's not fair. This is our life. My life." Elaine didn't even blink. Her lips parted, but the words that came were as calm and steady as they had always been. "Life is a series of choices, Rachel, and you've made yours. Now it's time for me to make mine." Rachel's eyes widened for a moment, disbelief crossing her face before it hardened again. "You can't just—" She cut herself off, shaking her head, her frustration pouring out. "You can't just take it all from us. We built a life here, a future. You think you're just going to walk in and make it yours again?" Elaine took a slow step back, her posture unmoving. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to explain herself. She had made her choice, and that was enough. "Rachel," Elaine said, the words deliberate, "the house is mine. The silence is mine. The future belongs to someone who will honor it." The truth hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Rachel's eyes flashed with anger, with something darker, resentment, perhaps even fear. She had underestimated Elaine, and now the cost of that mistake was far too high. "I'll fight this," Rachel hissed, her voice trembling with frustration. "I'll get a lawyer, I'll—" Jeremy's voice interrupted her, soft but insistent, his footsteps muffled in the distance before he appeared at the doorframe. "Rachel," he said, his tone strained, "you need to calm down." Rachel whipped around, her fury redirecting itself onto her husband. "Calm down? She's throwing us out, Jeremy. You're going to let her do this? You're just going to stand there and—" "Rachel, stop." Jeremy stepped into the room, his face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and fear. He looked over at Elaine for a moment before turning back to his wife. "You're not hearing her. She's already done it. It's over." Rachel's chest tightened as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "What are you talking about? You don't mean that." Jeremy hesitated, glancing nervously toward Elaine. Then, without another word, he pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped a few times before holding it up to Rachel. "She's already filed the county paperwork," he said quietly, his voice tight. "I've got the confirmation." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, eyes wide as if she couldn't believe it. "No. No." Her voice cracked. She looked back at Elaine, who had been so still, so calm through the entire confrontation. "You did this." Elaine didn't respond. She didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. Rachel's chest heaved as she tried to collect herself, her thoughts scrambling, and for the first time, she saw the reality of the situation. The house was gone. The life she thought she had was slipping through her fingers. Rachel's face flushed red, and without another word she stormed out of the room, her heels slamming against the floor with each angry step. The front door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the empty house. Jeremy stood there, his eyes fixed on the spot where Rachel had just been, his body still, the tension radiating from him in waves. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at Elaine. I didn't know, he murmured after a long pause. His voice cracked. I didn't know she would go this far. Elaine looked at him, her expression softening, if only just slightly. You've always been silent, Jeremy, and that's the problem. He swallowed, looking away, his face a mixture of guilt and confusion. He was lost, caught in the chaos between his wife's rage and his mother's quiet resolve. He didn't know what to do now. Elaine finally broke the silence, her voice softer, but still firm. It's done. It's over. And now, we wait. But the storm wasn't over yet. And in Rachel's mind, the fight had only just begun. Elaine sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edge of the paperwork. The stack of documents was thick, but it was all part of a process she had been building for years. Today, the final pieces were falling into place. A subtle shift in control, an unseen but sharp cut of power, would change the entire dynamic. She picked up her phone and dialed the number she knew by heart, the voice on the other end already expecting her. Clay, she said, her voice steady. I want the utilities transferred. No one will be able to tell it's mine. But it's done. There was a pause, then Clay's calm response. Understood. All services will be moved to your LLC within the next 24 hours. Everything will be seamless. Elaine's lips curled into a faint smile, the satisfaction of the moment sinking in. For years, Rachel had treated the house, the property, as if it were her own, without contributing a single dime toward its upkeep. Now, the control had shifted. The power was hers again, in a way that Rachel would never expect. The next morning, Rachel decided to host a brunch. She had invited a few friends, thinking it was the perfect opportunity to reassert control over the space that was still technically hers, but no longer hers in the way she wanted it to be. The sun had barely risen when she began setting out the food, a scattering of finger sandwiches, fruit, and pastries laid out across the dining room table. She had spent the morning arranging everything meticulously, making sure it looked perfect. But as the first guests arrived, she noticed something strange. The lights flickered, dimming briefly before returning to their usual brightness. It happened again a few minutes later, as if the house itself was mocking her, making everything feel unstable, out of control. Rachel shook her head, trying to ignore it, but when she turned on the faucet to fill a pitcher, the water pressure sputtered, the stream slowing to a weak trickle. She turned the tap off and on again, but it didn't improve. What the hell? She muttered under her breath. The house, her house, was failing her in every sense of the word. Later, Rachel wandered into the living room, trying to regain some semblance of composure in front of her guests. Her phone buzzed on the table, a text from the HOA. She opened it, her fingers frozen on the screen as she scanned the message. The HOA was issuing a notice. Violations for the excessive number of lawn ornaments, the patio furniture that hadn't been approved, the new upgrades Rachel had added to the outside of the house without any permissions. The power she thought she had was slipping from her grip, piece by piece. She could feel the anger bubbling up in her chest, but she knew she had no recourse. Elaine's influence was everywhere. Even the HOA, the very people Rachel had once made a point of charming, had turned on her. At the same time, Jeremy sat at his desk at work, trying to focus on his spreadsheets, but his thoughts kept wandering back to the chaos at home. His phone buzzed with a notification, a message from his boss. Jeremy, I need to speak with you. Let's meet at noon. It had been coming for weeks, the distracted look on his face, the slow decline in his productivity. All signs of a man pulled between the wreckage of his home life and his responsibilities. He couldn't even focus on work anymore. Every conversation seemed to circle back to Rachel's anger and the mounting mess at home. A few moments later, his boss appeared by his desk, her expression tight. Jeremy, you've been off lately. I'm giving you a formal warning. You need to get your act together, or there will be consequences. Jeremy's stomach turned. He couldn't afford this. Not right now. But he couldn't focus on anything else. Not with Rachel at the brink, not with everything falling apart around him. Elaine, on the other hand, was calm. The house, now fully under her control, had become her sanctuary. Avery had started coming over more often, walking across the street after school to do her homework in the quiet of Elaine's kitchen. Elaine watched her granddaughter carefully as Avery sat at the table, her pencil moving quickly across the page. Avery had always been a quiet observer, but there was something different in the air now. She could sense the change, feel the weight of it. Elaine didn't mind. The house was hers again, and she could sense the deep satisfaction of the transition. But even as she watched Avery work, a small smile tugging at her lips, Elaine knew there was one more piece to handle. She had already moved the utilities. She had already moved the money. Now, it was time for Rachel's attempts to regain control to be squashed. Rachel's complaint to the city council about the HOA violations was filed that afternoon, a final attempt to salvage some sense of authority. But by the time it landed on the desk of the city clerk, it had already been dismissed. The complaint wasn't even taken seriously. Elaine's quiet influence in the background had ensured that Rachel's voice, her complaints, meant nothing. Rachel was still trying to fight. She hadn't realized yet that the game was over, that the outcome had already been decided before the first blow had landed. Elaine leaned back in her chair, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout. All she had to do was cut the power and watch as Rachel's world unraveled piece by piece. The old wooden chair creaked beneath Elaine as she settled into it. The smooth edge of the document before her, a solid reminder of the years spent preparing for this moment. She had always known this day would come, had always prepared for it in quiet, methodical increments. Now, as the final pieces fell into place, the reality of the situation felt almost surreal. Clay slid a folder across the table to her, its contents simple but potent. The edges of the pages were crisp, freshly printed, and his hands were steady as he watched her. He didn't need to say anything. The paper spoke for itself. Elaine opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the neat lines of text. There, at the top of the page, was the date. 2 years ago. Rachel had signed it without a second thought. Signed it thinking she was above such things. It was a guest occupancy waiver, a document acknowledging that Rachel and Jeremy were, in fact, temporary residents of the property and not tenants. They had been given the privilege of staying in the house, but Elaine had always made sure the ground rules were clear. Rachel had signed this document, and now, 2 years later, it would be the very thing that would bring her down. The guest waiver was legal proof that Rachel and Jeremy had no claim to the house. It wasn't even close. No tenancy rights, no protections. The eviction was airtight. Elaine's breath slowed as she scanned the rest of the document. Her hand moved to pick up the pen next to her, and without hesitation, she signed the eviction packet, each stroke deliberate. The legal battle she'd known was coming was finally here, and Rachel, so sure of herself, had left herself vulnerable to a move Elaine had been planning for months. "Everything is in order," Clay said, watching her closely. "You're sure about this? Once it's filed, there's no going back." Elaine didn't look up immediately, but the decision had already been made. There was no turning back now. She placed the pen down with finality. "Do it. File it. They'll get their notice tomorrow." Hours later, Elaine's phone buzzed. It was a message from Laurel, her trusted attorney, and the words were simple but sharp. "They have no standing, no delay options. It's over." Elaine's eyes lingered on the message for a moment before she tucked the phone into her pocket. A quiet satisfaction settled in her chest, but there was no celebration, no relief, just calm. the kind of calm that came with knowing everything was as it should be. The phone buzzed again. "Elaine, please don't do this." The voice on the other end was Jeremy's, his tone pleading. He had been avoiding this conversation for days, but now, as the weight of the situation finally hit him, there was no way to run from it. Elaine let the phone ring for a moment, letting him hear the silence, the calm. She picked it up and pressed it to her ear. "Jeremy, it's done. It's already over." "No, it isn't," he said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. I don't know what happened to you, but this isn't right, Elaine. She's my wife. She's been part of this family for years. You can't just throw us out like we're nothing." His words stumbled out, tripping over each other in his panic. Elaine's eyes flicked toward the window, watching the afternoon light filter through the trees. She could hear the sound of the wind rustling the leaves, a reminder that some things had changed, while others had stayed the same. The house was hers again, and that was what mattered. "Jeremy, you've always been silent. You've always been the one to let things slide, to let Rachel take control. But I can't let that happen anymore." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "I'm done being the one who takes the back seat. I'm done letting you and Rachel think this house belongs to you. It doesn't. It never did. And now it's time for you to see that." Jeremy's voice faltered, but his next words came out in a rush. "I can't let you do this. I can't let you—" "You already let me," Elaine interrupted. Her tone softened, but there was a quiet finality to it. "You stayed silent when it mattered, Jeremy. And now Rachel will see the consequences of that silence. She'll see what happens when you think you can just take and take and take without ever giving anything in return." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Elaine could hear Jeremy breathing, heavy and labored. She knew he didn't know how to fight this. He had never fought for anything, never fought for her, never fought for what was right. He had only ever fought to keep the peace, to keep Rachel happy. But peace, as she had learned, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by arrogance. Finally, Jeremy spoke again, his voice quiet. "I'll fight it. I'll make sure this isn't the end." Elaine's lips curled into a faint, almost pitying smile. "Jeremy, it's already over. The paperwork's filed. The next steps are in motion. Rachel won't be able to fight this. She'll see that soon enough." He didn't respond immediately. Elaine knew he was struggling with the reality of it all. His entire life had been one long deflection, and now, for the first time, he would have to face the fallout of that choice. The quiet decisions he had made, by standing by and saying nothing, had led them to this point. "I don't want this to be the end, Elaine," Jeremy said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to lose everything." Elaine stood up, her gaze steady. "Then stop standing by, Jeremy. Stop letting Rachel control everything. It's time to make a choice." And with that, she ended the call. The decision had been made. And now, as she sat in the stillness of the house, Elaine could feel the quiet power shift fully into her hands. Rachel would fight, but in the end, she would realize something Elaine had known all along. The house had always belonged to her. And now, the future belonged to Avery. And Rachel? She would finally understand what it meant to lose. Elaine stood by the back window looking out over the yard. The early morning sun filtered through the oak trees, casting long shadows over the driveway. She had planned everything down to the last detail, and now, as the movers began to arrive, the weight of it all settled over her like a cloak of finality. She had waited for this moment for years. For too long she had let Rachel think she could shape the world around her, rearrange the house to fit her ideal. But no more. Today, Elaine was taking back what was hers, what had always been hers. And Rachel would finally understand the depth of her mistake. Elaine glanced at the clock. By the end of the day, Rachel would have no illusions left about her place in this house. No more control. No more manipulation. She could hear the trucks pulling up now, the faint rumble of their engines creeping toward the house. The movers stepped out, their presence efficient, quiet. Elaine gave them a nod, and they got to work without a word, unloading boxes and crates, carefully moving everything in and out as if the house were a business transaction. Nothing more, nothing less. Rachel's car pulled into the driveway a little after noon. She had spent the morning arguing with Jeremy. At least, that's what Elaine imagined, judging by the tension in Jeremy's voice when she'd spoken to him earlier. It was clear to her that the walls were closing in on them both. Rachel had no idea how much further Elaine had planned. All Rachel could see was that her world, her house, was crumbling before her eyes. She stepped out of the car and froze. The sight that met her eyes made her blood run cold. There were boxes, everywhere, stacked neatly along the side of the driveway, all of her things, packed away, ready to be moved out. Her breath caught in her throat. "What the hell is this?" she muttered, her eyes darting from the boxes to the moving truck in the yard. Elaine stood in the doorway watching her. The corners of her mouth twitched, but there was no hint of satisfaction in the way she held herself, just a calm, steady presence that felt like the eye of a storm. "It's your last weekend," Elaine said, her voice low, almost too calm. "Make it count." Rachel's face contorted in disbelief, her lips trembling with fury. She stalked toward the pile of boxes, her heels striking the ground with an angry rhythm. "You can't do this, Elaine. You can't just—" Her words were a mix of disbelief and fury, her voice shaking with the effort to keep her composure. Elaine stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Oh, I can. And I just did." Rachel's eyes widened, her fists clenching at her sides. "You're taking everything from me. This was supposed to be mine, Elaine. This house. This life. You can't just erase it." Elaine's eyes flickered briefly to Jeremy, who was standing off to the side, looking as though the weight of the world had just fallen on his shoulders. He looked crushed, his face pale, his mouth slightly open as if he was about to say something but couldn't find the words. "You always let her do this," Elaine said softly, her gaze still on Rachel. "You never stood up to her. Not once. And now, you'll see the cost of that silence." Rachel's breath came out in sharp, ragged bursts, but she didn't back down. "You'll regret this," she spat. "I swear, you will." Jeremy took a hesitant step forward, but he didn't say anything, his expression a mix of regret and helplessness. Elaine knew he was torn, knew that part of him still wanted to fight for Rachel, but there was no fight left. There hadn't been for a long time. "You should have thought of that before," Elaine said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's too late now." Avery's figure appeared in the doorway, small and hesitant. She had been quiet all morning, but the sight of her grandmother and Rachel locked in this confrontation seemed to finally break the tension in the air. She walked slowly, her eyes flicking between Elaine and Rachel, her gaze uncertain but searching. "Grandma?" Avery asked softly, stepping into the yard. She was quiet, observant, the kind of child who noticed the smallest things. Elaine could see the way Avery was trying to make sense of the situation, of the way Rachel stood seething with rage and her father looked like he was about to collapse. Avery's gaze settled on Elaine. Then she walked over, her small arms wrapping tightly around her grandmother's waist. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. Of trust. Of a bond that had never been broken, even when everything else had. "I'm glad you didn't let her win," Avery said, her voice small but firm. Elaine's eyes softened as she looked down at her granddaughter. She wasn't sure if Rachel had heard the words, or if Jeremy had. But it didn't matter. Avery had understood. Avery knew what was at stake. "Me too," Elaine whispered, her fingers lightly brushing through Avery's hair. And for the first time in what felt like years, Elaine felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. The battle was over. The house was hers. Avery would inherit it all. And Rachel? She had lost. But even as Elaine held her granddaughter, even as the satisfaction of victory swirled in her chest, she knew this wasn't the end. Rachel would never accept defeat so easily. But for now, Elaine was content to let the silence linger in the air, knowing that Rachel's world was crumbling one piece at a time, and that, finally, she had won. Elaine sat in her study, the papers spread out in front of her like an intricate puzzle. The faint light from the late afternoon sun spilled in through the open window, casting long shadows across the room. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control, on her ability to plan every detail. But now, with the final decisions to be made, the weight of what she was about to do felt heavy in her chest. This would be the last step. After this, everything would be set. The first document was straightforward: the removal of Rachel and Jeremy from all real property bequests. It wasn't personal, it was just necessary. Rachel had overstepped, taken too much for granted, and Jeremy had allowed it. Elaine had been patient, but that patience had run out. Her pen moved across the paper, steady and unflinching. The names were crossed out, replaced with a single definitive line: Avery Mathers, her granddaughter, would inherit everything. It was simple, final. This house, the legacy of years spent building, would go to the one person who understood what it meant to cherish it. A sense of relief washed over her as she signed the document. It was the right thing to do. It had always been the right thing. She looked over at the photo on her desk, the family portrait, worn from years of handling but still precious. Frank had always said the house would be theirs, but now it was more than that. The house would belong to Avery, and no one else. Elaine pushed the signed document aside, reaching for the next one: the trust for Avery. Clay had already set it up, the trust that would ensure the house was hers when the time came. It wasn't just about passing down a piece of property. It was about creating a legacy, a future where Avery would have the stability that Rachel and Jeremy had never valued. Avery would inherit the house at the age of 25, a symbolic threshold, the age at which Elaine herself had taken on the responsibility of the home after Frank passed. But it wasn't just about the house. It was about passing on the lessons, the quiet strength of keeping what mattered close, of never losing sight of what was truly important. Elaine leaned back in her chair for a moment, letting the weight of her decisions settle. She knew Rachel would never understand why Elaine had done this, but Avery would. Avery had always been the one to see things clearly. As Elaine finished her work, she picked up the phone, dialing Clay. The phone rang a few times before he answered, his voice calm and steady as always. "Elaine," he said, "everything's in place?" "It's all done," Elaine replied, her voice firm. "Make sure the trust is in place for Avery, and Clay, make sure there's a delay clause. She can't touch the house until she's 25. No one gets to touch it until she's ready." "Understood," Clay said. "It's done. Avery will have everything when the time is right." Elaine nodded, though he couldn't see her. There was finality in his words. It was done. There would be no more arguing, no more claims from Rachel. The legacy, the house, would be Avery's. Later that evening, Elaine found herself walking to the mailbox. The world outside was quiet, peaceful almost, but there was a quiet buzz in the air. She hadn't expected Rachel to give up. Not yet. She would be trying, of course, but Elaine had prepared for this. The next round of legal battles? Not her problem. Just as she reached the mailbox, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Laurel. Rachel tried to call. I ignored it. Elaine smiled, her fingers gripping the edges of the mailbox. She could imagine Rachel frantic, trying to claw her way back into a situation that was already slipping through her fingers. It was over for Rachel. As Elaine turned away from the mailbox, her phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Jeremy. Elaine, I don't know what to do. I need to talk. Elaine stared at the message for a long moment. She could hear the desperation in his words, the frustration that he had been caught between Rachel's demands and his mother's quiet power. But there was no room for indecision now. No more chances to sidestep reality. Elaine thought for a moment, then typed her response. Jeremy, I've already made my decision. There's nothing left to discuss. She hit send and walked back into the house, her footsteps sure, each step marking the end of a chapter, the beginning of something new. Later that night, as she sat at her desk, Elaine wrote in a journal she had kept for years. It had been her outlet, her way of processing everything, of making sense of the silence and the noise of her life. As she wrote, her hand steady, she knew that this would be the last entry she would write as the keeper of this home. And then she wrote the last line, the words that felt like both an end and a beginning. I did what was necessary. I kept the legacy alive. And the future will belong to those who understand it. Elaine closed the journal and placed it in the drawer, locking it away. There was no need to explain herself. Avery had always been the one to understand. And now, she would carry the lessons Elaine had lived by. Elaine stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the house that had been her life, her legacy. It was hers again. And now, it was Avery's. For Rachel, it was already too late. The chill of December had settled into the air, and the heavy silence that had hung over the house for months was now punctuated by the faint sounds of the holidays, the soft clink of ornaments, the crackle of a fire, the distant hum of carols. Yet for Rachel, Christmas had never felt more foreign. She had tried over the past few days to rally some semblance of support. She called her mother. She called cousins, aunts, anyone who might give her the strength to face this humiliating loss. She needed someone, anyone, to back her up. To tell her she wasn't crazy for fighting so hard. But the responses she received were lukewarm, if not outright dismissive. No one wanted to get involved. Not after everything had already been decided. Jeremy had always been passive, too concerned with avoiding confrontation to truly help. Her calls to him were met with silence. He didn't want to be part of the fight. At first, Rachel had been furious with him for not taking her side, but now, in the quiet of the empty house, she understood. He didn't know how to fight for anything, and frankly, neither did she. Rachel stood in the living room, staring at the holiday decorations. The garland along the mantel seemed out of place, like a strange mockery of the season. The tree, still decorated with the same ornaments from years before, stood at the corner of the room, its twinkling lights flickering as if to remind her of the life that had been taken from her. She paced in a slow, rhythmic way, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, but her thoughts were far away. Christmas was supposed to be a time of renewal, of family, of warmth. But this year, it felt hollow. The house, the one she had worked so hard to reshape, was slipping through her fingers. Her vision for the future was already gone. Across town, Elaine had created something entirely different, a Christmas Eve that was quiet, intimate, and full of peace. She had invited Clay and Laurel, two of the few people she trusted, along with Avery. Rachel was no longer part of this world. Not here, not in this place. And Elaine wasn't sure whether that was a relief or a regret. All she knew was that it was final. The table was set with care. A small gathering, but one full of warmth. The turkey, golden and perfectly roasted, sat at the center, surrounded by candles that flickered softly, casting a gentle glow across the room. The scent of rosemary and thyme mingled with the faint smell of pine from the tree in the corner. There were no grand speeches, no pretense. Just a quiet meal with the people Elaine had chosen to share this night with. Avery sat beside her, her small hands folded neatly in her lap as she quietly admired the table. Her eyes darted from the turkey to the candles, and for a moment, Elaine could see the glimmer of something in her granddaughter's face. Something she hadn't seen in Rachel's eyes for years. Gratitude. "I'm glad we're here, Grandma," Avery said softly, her voice full of sincerity. "It's perfect." Elaine smiled at her, a gentle warmth spreading through her chest. "So am I, sweetheart," she said. "So am I." Outside, the moving truck idled by the curb, the engine rumbling as the movers unloaded Rachel's belongings. There was no fanfare, no celebration. The men worked quietly, their motions efficient and quick. They were just doing their job. They had no stake in the drama unfolding behind closed doors. Rachel stood at the edge of the driveway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched them. The humiliation was written all over her face. She had tried, she had fought, but there was no stopping it now. The house, the life she had built for herself in her mind, was slipping away. Her voice broke the silence, sharp and furious. "What do you think you're doing?" she screamed at the movers. "This is still my house." But the movers didn't respond. They didn't even glance at her as they continued their work, placing her belongings into the truck with a practiced indifference. Rachel's eyes narrowed, her chest heaving with rage. "Stop! Stop right there!" she yelled, but her words felt empty. She had no power here. The house wasn't hers anymore. Her anger surged and she pushed forward, her hands raised as if she could stop the inevitable. "You can't do this. I'm not leaving." But one of the movers, a tall man with a thick accent, turned to her with an expression of simple professionalism. "Ma'am, we've been instructed to take everything. It's not personal." Rachel's hands dropped, the fight draining out of her as the finality of it all settled in. Her lip trembled with the weight of the truth. She wasn't in control anymore. She never had been. Jeremy stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, staring at the ground. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His silence was louder than anything Rachel could say. She glanced at him and for the first time saw the weariness in his eyes. He had given up. "Jeremy," she said softly, a plea in her voice. "You have to do something. Please, don't let them do this." But Jeremy didn't answer. He didn't move. The pain of it was almost unbearable. Rachel's chest tightened as she realized the truth. This was the end of everything she had fought for. Inside, at Elaine's table, the quiet was palpable. Clay, Laurel, and Avery were talking softly, laughter occasionally breaking the silence. But there was no tension, no lingering bitterness. Elaine looked around the table, taking in the warmth of the moment, the peace she had fought for. Not with words, but with action. Her hand rested on Avery's, the younger woman looking up at her with wide eyes, her gratitude evident in the way she held her gaze. And in the next moment, Elaine knew. She had done the right thing. The house was finally hers again. And Rachel? Rachel had already lost. Elaine sat at her desk, her fingers tracing the edge of the legal papers before her. The pen was steady in her hand as she signed the final document, Avery's Education Trust. The weight of the ink on the paper was a quiet but undeniable act of finality. This house, this legacy, would one day belong to her granddaughter. And yet, Elaine knew that despite the quiet strength Avery had shown over the years, the time to truly claim this house wouldn't come for many years. For now, it would be hers, only in name. The trust ensured that the house would be secure. But Avery would need time to grow into the legacy that Elaine had fought so hard to protect. Elaine signed her name with care, each stroke a promise to her daughter-in-law, her son, and to herself. Avery, the one person who truly understood what the house meant, was now its heir. The decision was made. She paused, letting the pen hover over the final clause of the document. The trust would ensure that Avery wouldn't be able to sell the house or claim any profits from it until she turned 25. The time was important, a measure of protection for the home Elaine had spent her life building, for the lessons of family that would be passed down, for the legacy of strength and silence. It wasn't just about the house, it was about teaching Avery the weight of responsibility. Elaine took a deep breath before closing the folder with a snap that echoed in the otherwise quiet room. The last piece of the puzzle was complete. By the time the movers had finished and left, it was evening. The house was empty. The rooms that had once been filled with Rachel's clutter, her attempts at making the place hers, were silent. Elaine had already had a new lock installed on the front door. She stood in the doorway, the setting sun casting a soft golden glow through the large windows. Her fingers lingered on the new key in her hand, the one that would lock Rachel out for good. The key felt heavier than it should, as though it held more than just the promise of control. Elaine felt its weight settle in her chest. This key represented the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Rachel had never really understood what the house was about. She had always wanted to reshape it into something that reflected her own desires, her own control. But Elaine had held on, always knowing that one day the house would pass to the one who truly understood its meaning. Elaine walked to the front door, slipped the new key into the lock, and turned it. The satisfying click of the mechanism falling into place was almost musical. It was final. Rachel would never be able to get in again. Elaine picked up her phone, dialing Laurel's number. The line rang once, twice, before Laurel picked up. "Elaine?" Laurel's voice was warm but professional. "Everything settled?" Elaine smiled as she gazed at the door, her hand still resting on the handle. "It's done. I've had the locks changed and the deeds officially in Avery's name. The trust is in place. Rachel won't be able to get to it." Laurel's voice was full of approval. "And the do not trespass notice?" Elaine's lips curved upward slightly. "It's filed, covers the entire property, driveway included." Laurel paused, the gravity of the moment settling over both of them. "I think Rachel's going to be, well, shocked when she realizes how far things have gone." Elaine's eyes drifted toward the windows, the moving truck's final rumble still echoing in the distance. She knew that Rachel, furious as she was, would never understand the depth of Elaine's resolve. She'll have to accept it, and if she doesn't, well, that's her problem. Hours later, Elaine was in the kitchen, preparing a light dinner for herself and Avery. The air in the house felt different, lighter. The weight of Rachel's presence was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost sacred space. Avery had been there all afternoon, doing homework, her soft voice filling the air with stories of school and friends. Avery walked in, her face lit with an almost uncontainable energy. She stopped in the doorway, staring at Elaine for a long moment before walking over and wrapping her arms around her grandmother. "Grandma," Avery whispered, her voice full of something Elaine had only heard from her once before. A deep, unspoken understanding. "Thank you." Elaine froze, the weight of Avery's gratitude hanging in the air between them. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Maybe a smile, maybe a hug. But this was different. Avery's embrace wasn't just a gesture of affection. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the sacrifice Elaine had made. Elaine ran her hand through Avery's hair, her eyes moistening slightly. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. This house will always be yours one day. But right now, it's about protecting it, about keeping the legacy alive." Avery pulled back slightly, her brown eyes wide with sincerity. "I'll take care of it, Grandma. I promise." Elaine's heart swelled. She knew, in that moment, that Avery would. She would honor the house, the legacy, in ways Rachel never could. And someday, when the time was right, Avery would take her place in this home. Her home. Elaine stepped back, wiping away the unexpected tear that had fallen, and smiled softly. "I know you will." The sound of the wind picked up outside, and the soft rustle of the trees outside the kitchen window felt like a promise in the air. The house, silent and strong, stood tall in the fading light. For the first time in years, Elaine could finally breathe. The legacy was secure. The future was safe. And Rachel? She would never understand the price of her arrogance. The office was quiet, the kind of stillness that settled over everything after a decision had been made. Elaine sat at her desk, the soft hum of the heater in the corner, the only sound accompanying the flicker of the candle she had lit for ambiance. She'd always kept a candle burning in the evenings. It was a habit passed down from her mother. The gentle light softened the edges of the world, made everything feel just a little less sharp. Today, though, it felt like a symbol. Elaine opened the file cabinet, retrieving the manila envelope she had set aside days ago. The weight of it was heavier than it appeared, and she paused for a moment, fingers resting on the smooth surface, before pulling it open. Inside, everything she'd meticulously documented was contained: receipts, dates, screenshots of texts, even email exchanges. Each piece told the story of the past few years. It was the quiet but undeniable proof of the disrespect Rachel had shown her, of the entitled disregard Rachel had fostered in her own life. Elaine's pen hovered over the page as she adjusted the receipts in order, her fingers tracing the dates. There, in the margins, were notes, small notations from her time with Rachel's family, written like a timeline of patience running out. Every example, every incident of Rachel's behavior was catalogued in detail. The things Elaine had endured, the small slights, the moments when Rachel pushed too far. It had never been about getting back at Rachel. It was simply about documentation, something that could never be erased. Elaine sighed, looking at the list of facts in front of her. The receipts from the utilities Rachel had never paid for. The screenshots of text messages, Rachel's calls for more things. Decorations, gifts, anything that could make the house her own. The constant demands, the endless sense of entitlement. Elaine had borne it all with silence, but no longer. This document wasn't just for Rachel. It was for Avery, too. When the time came, when Avery was old enough to inherit the house, she would inherit the full story as well. Avery would understand, just as Elaine had. The house was more than just bricks and beams. It was about family, loyalty, and respect. And it would be Avery's responsibility to ensure it was never taken for granted again. She would learn the full history, every moment of disrespect, every reason Elaine had to act the way she did. The legacy wasn't just financial. It was the story of what had happened, and why it mattered. Elaine took a deep breath and carefully slipped the documents back into the envelope. It was done. She sealed it, then set it in a drawer, a place where it would be found when the time was right. The phone buzzed on the table, breaking the quiet. Elaine glanced at the screen. Laurel's name. "Elaine." Laurel's voice came through the speaker, her tone warm but professional. "Rachel's requested mediation. She wants to sit down and work this out." Elaine's lips pressed together in a thin line. Mediation? It was almost laughable, but not entirely unexpected. Rachel wouldn't go quietly. "No," Elaine said firmly, her voice steady. "Tell her it's been filed. No mediation. There's nothing left to discuss." Laurel paused, a slight chuckle in her voice. "Understood. I'll make sure that's communicated clearly." Elaine hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, letting the weight of the decision settle in her chest. Rachel was still trying to fight, but she was too late. The house was already gone from her grasp. The trust had been set. Avery was its rightful heir. The fight was over. Later, Jeremy's name flashed on the screen, and Elaine's heart sank. She had known this moment would come, though she had hoped he might have remained silent through it all. "Elaine, can Avery still visit the house?" His voice sounded distant, like he wasn't sure where he stood anymore. Elaine exhaled slowly, her hand hovering over the phone before she pressed it to her ear. "Of course, Jeremy. She's always welcome here. The house is hers when the time comes." She could hear the strain in his voice, the guilt still hanging over him. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. I thought we could work it out." Elaine didn't respond immediately, feeling the weight of his words linger between them. She had never expected him to fully understand. He'd never truly fought for anything, least of all for his own place in this family. But now, it didn't matter. She had fought. And she had won. "You've been silent, Jeremy. You let Rachel take the lead. Now, we both have to live with the consequences of that silence." Elaine's voice softened. "Avery will understand. She'll carry this legacy. Not Rachel. Not you." Jeremy's voice was faint, as though his words were trapped somewhere in the space between them. "I know. I hope she'll be okay." "She will be." Elaine's voice was steady now, her resolve firm. "Avery is strong. She's already learned the most important lesson, respect for what's ours. She'll honor this house." There was a pause before Jeremy spoke again. "Thank you." Elaine didn't answer immediately. The words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over her. This wasn't about thanks. It was about ensuring the future was protected. She hung up the phone and placed it back on the table, her fingers lingering for a moment on the cold surface. She had done what she needed to do. Rachel had lost. And Avery would inherit everything. Every asset, every lesson, and every moment of silence that spoke louder than words. The house felt different now. Not in the way Rachel had tried to make it hers. Frivolous, temporary, but in a way that had purpose, that had weight. The floors, the walls, the furniture, everything had a deeper meaning now, a quiet strength that had settled over the place. Elaine knew the house would be hers again, in all its quiet glory, and it would belong to Avery when the time was right. That evening, as snow began to fall outside, Elaine stood in the kitchen, overseeing the final touches on what was to become a new tradition, a winter supper. No fanfare, no extravagant displays, just warmth, just family. Just the people who understood what it meant to honor the past while moving forward. Avery flitted about the kitchen, her hands quick as she set the silverware in perfect alignment, making sure everything was just so. Her quiet hum filled the space as she worked, the comfort of her presence weaving a soft thread through the evening. Elaine watched her granddaughter carefully, savoring the simplicity of the moment. The house was quiet, peaceful, just the way it was meant to be. "There," Avery said, stepping back from the table, hands placed on her hips. "All set, just like you wanted it." Elaine smiled, her heart full. "Perfect," she replied softly. "You're learning well." Avery beamed, taking a step back and joining Elaine at the counter, her hands brushing against the tablecloth that had been folded and placed with care. The candlelight flickered in the corner, casting soft shadows across the room. For all the years of turbulence, of tension, of silence, tonight felt like the calm after the storm. As the last of the guests arrived, the familiar faces of friends and neighbors filled the house. Clay came in first, his presence warm and steady as always. He had been a friend to Elaine through thick and thin, a quiet ally in every sense of the word. Laurel followed, bringing a little laughter with her as she greeted everyone with the easy charm that had always made her a welcome presence. There were no grand speeches, no awkward exchanges, just the familiar, comforting sounds of old friends coming together. And then, there was the table. Set in the dining room, everything looked perfect. Simple, yet elegant. The turkey, golden and juicy, sat at the center, surrounded by sides that had been prepared with care. The plates were filled with food, but it wasn't about the meal. It was about the people, the warmth they brought, the unspoken understanding that tonight was something different. Tonight wasn't about what was lost, but what remained. Elaine sat at the head of the table, her gaze steady and calm. Her eyes flicked to the chair beside her, the one that Rachel had always taken for granted. That chair was empty, just as Rachel's presence had been emptied from the house. It wasn't out of malice that Elaine had chosen to leave it empty. It was intentional. Rachel's place at the table, her place in the house, was no more. And that was not just Elaine's decision. It was the result of years of silence, years of letting Rachel think she could reshape everything without consequence. Avery took her seat beside Elaine, her small hand gently resting on the table. The room was full, the laughter low and comforting, but there was no awkwardness. This was the way it was meant to be. No need for speeches, no need for toasts. Just the people who mattered, the ones who had always been there, who understood the value of family, the importance of loyalty. Clay leaned back in his chair, his glass raised in a casual but meaningful gesture. He caught Elaine's eye and offered a small smile before clinking his glass, the sound sharp and clear in the stillness. "To the matriarch who paid every bill, in full," he said with a light chuckle. But his words were full of respect. Elaine's lips curved upward at the compliment, but she didn't respond right away. The warmth in the room, the respect in his voice, was all that needed to be said. There was no need for more. Everything had been done. She had earned that moment, not through grand gestures, not through angry confrontations, but through quiet, steady perseverance. Avery looked up at Elaine, her eyes bright with understanding. Elaine could see the deep appreciation in her granddaughter's gaze. Avery knew what was at stake. She understood the weight of the house, of the family legacy, of the sacrifices that had been made to keep it intact. And as Elaine looked around the table, she realized that this quiet moment was what it had all been for. It wasn't about Rachel's fights or Jeremy's silence. It was about this, about Avery, about the future, and about the quiet legacy that would live on long after tonight. The room seemed to pause, the air thick with meaning, before Elaine raised her glass, the crystal glinting in the soft candlelight. "To family," she said, her voice steady, full of years of strength and resilience. "To what's ours." And for the first time in years, Elaine felt the weight of everything lift off her shoulders. The past was gone, the future secure. The house was hers. And more importantly, it would one day belong to Avery. As the night stretched on, the fire in the hearth crackled and popped, the warmth filling the room. The laughter grew louder, the conversations richer. There was an ease to the evening, an understanding that this was a new chapter for the house, for the family. But outside, in the distance, the faintest sound of a car door slamming echoed from the driveway. Rachel wasn't done yet. Elaine sat at the kitchen table, the soft light of the afternoon spilling over her shoulder. In front of her was a small, neatly folded card, the kind Avery would make for her. Simple, heartfelt. She'd been too busy to look at it earlier in the evening, but now, as the warmth of the day began to fade into twilight, Elaine opened it with a sense of quiet anticipation. The card was a drawing, rough but sincere. A sketch of the house, with its grand oak trees and the porch that had seen so many years of life. Avery had added a line beneath it, written in her careful cursive handwriting. "I'll protect what you gave me." Elaine felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the warmth that only Avery's small, unwavering understanding could bring. This wasn't just a drawing, it was a promise. A legacy passed down through hands that were still small, but knew what it meant to carry the weight of family. Elaine folded the card gently and placed it in her desk drawer, alongside the trust documents and the will that had set everything in motion. She had secured the future, not just for Avery, but for the house, for the family, for everything that mattered. Later, after a quiet dinner, Elaine sat on the porch, cradling a cup of tea in her hands. The sky was fading into dark, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves in the trees, a soft backdrop to the solitude of the evening. The house stood tall, strong in its quiet defiance, its legacy intact. There was no more Rachel to worry about. No more arguments, no more unspoken threats. Everything had been settled. For the first time in years, Elaine allowed herself to just be. She let the silence embrace her, let the weight of everything she had fought for fall away. The familiar buzz of her phone broke the stillness, and Elaine reached for it without hesitation. It was a message from Clay, his words succinct as always. "It's all closed. You kept every receipt." Elaine smiled to herself as she read the message, the faint satisfaction of a well-executed plan settling in her chest. She had done everything right. Every receipt, every document, every detail had been handled with precision. She had spent wisely. And now, it was all hers. And spent them wisely. She typed the response quickly, the words coming naturally, the finality of it all evident in the simplicity of her reply. Later, just before dusk, the sound of footsteps approached the porch. Elaine turned, the soft smile on her face widening as Avery stepped up the stairs, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Grandma," Avery said, her voice full of energy as she sat down beside Elaine. "I'm starving. Ready for leftovers?" Elaine chuckled softly, the sound of it feeling more like a celebration than a joke. It had been a long road, but now, with Avery here, things felt like they were exactly where they needed to be. There was no room for Rachel's chaos, no more need for arguments. This was the new family dynamic. Just the quiet certainty of what had been built, and the future that was now safe. As the evening settled into a quiet peace, Elaine looked out at the house. Everything was as it should be. There was no more fight left. She had protected everything that mattered. The legacy. The future. It was secure. And Rachel? Elaine's mind drifted back to that Thanksgiving dinner when Rachel had whispered to her husband, thinking she was out of earshot, "She eats for free, throw her out." Elaine smiled faintly, the words echoing in her mind. The bill had come, indeed. But it hadn't been Rachel's to collect. It had been her own, signed in full. And now, the cost of Rachel's arrogance was hers to bear alone. But for Elaine, the fight was over. The legacy was secure. And Avery? Avery would take it from here.